thought what we could do is sort of talk about the journey so far, particularly for those who haven't gone to all the lectures. So there's this idea of going back to go forward. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of get, hopefully, some people up to speed on some pretty interesting but also pretty depthy sort of topics. So the first topic, or the first discussion that we had was around the Western dreaming, about these grand narratives. And these were the great stories that we proposed, and it really came from this book of Richard Tarnas. Which is this idea of the passion of the Western mind. So again, this is a very popular book amongst philosophy schools, or had been all around the Western world, and it's a really good basic introduction to how the West thinks the way it does. But his argument recently, is that there were certain kind of sacrifices when one story was basically challenged and another one gave birth to another. For instance, the Hellenic sacrifice was Socrates basically argued, think for yourself, and the gods were punished for this, and what rose was really the birth of Western philosophy, which, whether you like it or not, points back to Sophocles, Socrates, Aristotle, and the other one that I've forgotten, Plato. Now, just like Christ, Socrates doesn't write anything. It's Plato that writes about Socrates. But there's a different sacrificial aspect to Socrates than Christ. And the difference between the story of Christ and Socrates is that Christ asks a story about being, who I am. And we're going to be coming back to that story because it threads all the way through the Western dreaming, and it keeps Western people up at night in a funny kind of way. And this third lecture actually deals with that through Holbein's painting. The Hebraic sacrifice is that in order for a single source or proclamation of a single source of reality, violations had to occur, both aesthetic and moral. That is, killing your son is not a very good thing to do, nor is it aesthetic. It's actually a repugnant, repulsive thing to do. So, but to do it, to actually transcend these, brought in the transcendent, which is Caravaggio's brilliance of showing the angel, you can't see that, but arresting Abraham's hand away from the knife, which brings in both the physical and the metaphysical together as a proclamation of one singular source of reality. Now that's a very strong claim, of which, and this is the important bit, three major credos or creeds are born out of it, which are the Abrahamic creeds. The creed of Jerusalem being the source and comfort for the Jewish people, and the ultimate salvation comes through Jerusalem. The Christian credos, which we'll be talking about, and the most powerful of all of them, which actually gave birth to the fastest growing religion in humanity, which is Islam, which only has one creed, which you would know, which is that there is only one God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Christianity has over 200 creeds, of which two of them survive mostly in the common vernacular, which is the Nicene and the Constantinople Creed, which we'll be talking about. Christ comes in as a perfect sacrifice where what gets punished isn't a single source of truth, but what gets punished is the escalation of violence as a way of resolving conflict. Gandhi gets it. Gandhi gets the story of Christ and operates it better than probably anybody in history, I would suggest, apart from maybe St. Francis. But the idea is that perfect sacrifice is to actually show that the origin of God is love, and love is perfect sacrifice. It serves creation. It doesn't actually oppose power, but actually subjugates it through an act of non-violence. And then this is the actual sacrificial process that disturbs and keeps people awake. It gives birth to a whole bunch of proclamations, which includes caritas, or love, which gives the word hospitality, which is the origin of our hospitals and hospice care, which were an invention of the West. So in the 3rd century, the implementation of hospitality towards the other was a part of that credo, the creed of Christian witness and non-violence. The heliocentric sacrifice basically punishes the church, because the church gets in and codifies Christ and makes these proclamations about that we revolve around the Son. Sorry, the other way around. Sorry. The heliocentric sacrifice is that we actually revolve around the Son. But what gets sacrificed is actually the authority of the church, and this gives birth to the scientific proclamation of fact. Now, the interesting thing about facts, by the way, is that the facts that we know are a certain kind of fact. If you've studied philosophy, it's a logical positivism. It's a fact based upon the physical world. But Aristotle and the Hebrews know that there are other kinds of facts. There's mythic facts, there's poetic facts. There are other ways of knowing truth claims. But this one has been driving out the others, and we'll be talking about that quite a bit today. And then the anthropocentric sacrifice is the one that we're in now. Both the scientific gets co-opted into the technological, Christ is dead, materialism, and everything gets pushed out, including, it seems, the earth itself. So what's now being sacrificed is the weight of the earth to provide the ecosystem's resources necessary for the inflation of the anthropocentric centre, us. Like I said to the sustainability kids, that if we found the perfect technology where we didn't have to have any cost, I think I might have mentioned, any cost to energy, we'd still ruin the planet. Because it's an ethical relationship that needs to be examined, not just one of efficiency. Because we would now know how to efficiently destroy it without any cost, where the costs now have been externalised. Aboriginal cultures around the world know this. They say it in their dreaming. So that was the first lecture, if you didn't come. And that's a synopsis of those who did. The second one was really the one that obsesses me, I guess, as a psychologist, which is the constitution of the self and where it comes from. And we talked about these two great books that talk back to each other over 1,000 years. So in around the 5th century, Augustine says something that's really kind of interesting. He says that the only thing he knows to be true is that he doubts. Now, Descartes midrashes this. He retells it. And I'll go to Descartes. But Augustine says the only thing I know to be true is that I'm full of doubt. What am I doubting about? And it's really the source and seeking of ultimate being, which he describes or declares as God. And then comes to the final conclusion that constitution, the final place of where we come into our own being, is in the mystery of God. Now, I'm not talking about the big guy with the beard. I'm talking about the ground of being, the very kind of mystery of which the source of all things give rise to. Or as St. Augustine says, God is not a thing, but a happening. So we've known that for a long time in mystical theology. God is more of an event or a possibility than an actual object. So all of the criticisms of the God thing is actually an objectified or thingified thing. God, in Augustine's sense, and certainly in Aquinas, is not supra to a particular level, is not in any level of being. This was resolved ages ago, but it returns, and I'll explain why. But basically Rousseau says something else that's actually like catnip to the European imagination, which was us as a project, me. So he says something like this, that I've resolved on enterprise and the enterprise is me. The modern self is born in the 16th century, of which people like Freud take up the cudgels, and Nietzsche in particular. So this project is me, and he does something interesting. He displays it to mankind, of which we then are asked to imitate. And it's really the birth of the modern notion of freedom, but there's a problem with it, is that we are now no longer looking at the transcendent, but at each other. And the problem, of course, is that it leads to an entanglement of desire. We desire what other people are imitating, which I guess at its ultimate conclusion is a consumptive society. Is that okay? And that's kind of where we got to. And where you constitute matters. One is constituted in mystery that doesn't need justification, which is Christian freedom, because one is then resting in mystery itself. Or the constant growth of self-exploration. So you either go on a self-exploration quest to improve yourself, which is usually maybe or possibly a false self, one that's worthy of imitation, or that one just rests in the fact that we're just simply mystery, like the ultimate mystery, which is what we call God, which is Augustine's way out of his existential dilemma. But we said to hell with that, for good and bad reasons. So I want to start with this particular picture before we move to Holbein. Is that okay? So does that give you sort of a background? Now, this picture was painted in 1522 by Holbein, who's a German painter, but spends most of his time both in Italy and in particular in the UK. For a Christian, this is actually probably the most controversial painting that you could ever gaze on. Because at 25 years of age, he proclaims something about Christ. Now, in Credo, the creed, what one believes in, is that in the Christian narrative, Jesus is asking about being. And what he asks to Peter is, who do you say I am? What he's saying, in a sense, is, what is my substance and origin? Now, the important bit that the Christians build around this is that that question gets asked in every age. Is that okay? It's not a question to Peter. It's a question to each individual within the culture itself. The Western dreaming has been grappling with that question of that issue. Holbein answers it at the age of 25, very simply but horrifically. In fact, Dostoevsky said to even gaze on this painting would be enough for any believer to lose their faith. This is serious business. But if you don't know the Christian story or have a Christian inheritance, it doesn't have any real significant bearing when you gaze on it. But for a Christian, it's actually saying that Christ is like the rest of us. Resurrection as a narrative, whether it's right or wrong, is meant to serve one important contribution, that there is the death of death. That death does not have the final answer in terms of our being, our substance. So the Christian witness is to say that something is transcendent. But in this painting, Holbein says that he is just one amongst many. He is just like the rest of us. There is no resurrection. And we know this because there is mortis. And if you can see the rigor mortis setting in on his, see his hands there? Holbein paints this deliberately because the healing hands of Christ no longer heal. They are just death. And so there is no transcendence. There is just death. Now for him at 25, this is coming around when the Catholic Church is starting to spin off its own axis. Not only that, but the Reformation is starting to have its really strong sway in what it means to be a Western person. All of the iconography is stripped bare, and the Christ that the whole Western dreaming was basically revolving around starts to fracture. Is that okay? It shows that really, in the end, that there is no transcendent witness as a story in the West. That there is only us. in fact, by killing Christ, Carroll, who wrote the book The Western Dreaming, The Wreck of the Western Culture, which is the book I'm using tonight. So I used a book from a philosopher on the first, I used a book from a theologian in the second, and I'm using a book from a sociologist who I really like because he makes terrifically bold claims. And his book, The Existential Jesus, The Wreck of the Western Culture and The Western Dreaming, are books that I keep on returning because he is passionate about the notion of the Jewish tradition of midrash, which is to retell stories to a new age. That the responsibility of culture is to retell the stories in light of what we're facing now. Why is that important, folks? It may not be important to you, but I think I mentioned about the book The Jew and the Lotus Flower, where the Jews go to Dharamsala to talk to the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama's culture is under significant threat. The Mahayana tradition is under significant threat in its very seat of origin, called Tibet. Now he asks the Jewish rabbis, how have you managed to keep your culture alive for 3,500 years? It's about the same time as Buddhism. And the rabbi said, tell the stories in the family. Hold and retell the stories to keep your culture together. It's important. And it's this that we've been talking about in those grand narratives. And this is but one of them. But you can't talk about the Western dreaming, unfortunately or fortunately, whatever way you like, without looking at Christ. Another way of saying it is that the new world is empty of authority over death. There is no authority over death anymore. Carroll argues that in order to bring a new culture into the West, you had to kill Christ. He says to wipe the cultural slate clean, this story had to go. But with his confidence at 25 years of age, 11 years later, he does another painting. And it's this one, I hope. Oh, this has run out of juice. It's called The Ambassadors. And Holbein paints it in 1533. It's 11 years now. So the confidence of a 25-year-old is now being pushed around a bit. And it's basically a double portrait. We don't have little double A's, do we, somewhere?
I don't.
No? Has anyone got any double A's on them? Doesn't matter. I've come prepared. Okay, so these two gentlemen, it's a double portrait. And it's a portrait of two ambassadors. And he paints them in such a manner that both men are in equal proportion, pretty much, within the painting. And they are French. And both of them are ambassadors of two things. Jean de Tonfel, this guy on the left here, is 29 years of age, and we know that because it's inscribed apparently in his scabbard. And he is an ambassador to England. His friend is a bishop, and he's a bishop of the French Catholic tradition. And his name is de Salve. And I don't know French, but salve I think comes from salve. So the idea of salvation. Salve means balm, actually. So salvation is a healing balm. But these two men are at the top of their games, you see. They are the authority of the time. They are the ambassadors of both science and reason and of religion and metaphysics. Now, in the middle of the painting is can you see that, which is a two-tiered desk, bookshelf. And on the top of the top shelf, which is interesting because it's elevated upwards, are the instruments of science. So these are all the instruments that are used to measure and weigh things. So the word rationality, as you should, maybe you do know or don't know, comes from the Latin word ratio. which is to make a ratio, a measurement of things, to weigh things. So rationality is to weigh, and all of these are instruments of astronomy and astrology. And they have the authority of rationality. They are the ambassadors of science, the ambassador of reason alone as a way of claiming truth. It's interesting in a way because Carroll says that Holbein deliberately traps the two men inside the actual frame of the picture, and he points the actual elevation forward as though the men are falling forward. There's a certain kind of unsteadiness of these men on their feet, as though that they aren't sure where they stand. And in addition to this, he makes the men's gaze somewhat lifeless, as though that the men themselves don't have any soul. So that the ambassadors of these stories, one of religion and the other one of humanism, even at the very birth of humanism, is already unsteady on its feet. And there's a reason for it. But before I go there, I want to talk about the bottom shelf. On the bottom shelf are the instruments of religion, poetry, and art. So there's the lute, and there's the Book of Psalms, which is essentially a book of poems, and I think a Lutheran missal, I think, but it's a missal. It's a hymn sheet. You've heard that saying, singing from the same hymn sheet. I think people have retold it now, singing from the same song sheet. The original saying is singing from the same hymn sheet. People would sing together, and in fact, in the Christian tradition, people would sing the credo. So the creed wasn't spoken, but sung. So singing was a proclamation of a certain kind of truth. Here's the important bit. The strings are broken on the lute. So the very kind of aspects of the religious certainty are now no longer having the same hold and sway on the culture. There's something quite strange in the painting. And you can see this, by the way, if you go to London, from their National Museum. And I must admit I haven't seen it, so next time I go to London I'm going to go check it out. But at the very centre of the painting is an amorphic skull. It's a skull that can only be seen... Now, when it was first displayed, it was displayed, I believe, I don't know if this is true, or maybe it's something I might have read or made up, that the painting was displayed, on a grand entrance where you have to walk on these stairs. So the idea is that you walk around. So all these people of high culture would walk around and see this wonderful painting. And as they walk around at a certain angle, the skull comes into perfect position and frame. The important thing is that the skull is amorphic because it's a way of signifying that you can't stare at death directly. It can only be understood obtusely. And neither of these men have any answer to that great question. Remember the three questions I talked about with culture? Where is our origin? Where do we come from? So we might come from amoebas, or we may come from the Big Bang, or from the love of God. What are we to do when we're here, which is the moral imperative, how to live our lives. And the third one is what happens to us when we die. This one is around the skull. Now, here's the important bit. During the same century, or within the next 20 years, Hamlet is written. Now, Hamlet as a story is the most common story played in the Western world. And so the existential question of Hamlet staring at the skull is a question to the culture. What do we do with death? The interesting thing that Hamlet is that Hamlet dithers. He loses his resolve. And this is what, in some ways, Holbein's saying. That's what the skull looks like when seen at the right angle. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the skull actually apparently is at the same proportion when you see it, which I haven't done it because I don't know how to do it properly, is at the same proportion as the skull of the men. Essentially, the men are having to move forward into the skull and they have no response to it. Either we're just a random selection of the right, to survival as a scientific proclamation that goes nowhere. Because in order for Darwinism to exist, it can't have a teleos, it can't have an end of things. There's no end to the story of Darwinism. But if you don't tell the story properly of religion, nor does that. And this is the problem of the two. So the gaze is really hollow in front of the big cultural question. Something happened to Holbein between the confidence of the death of Christ and painting the ambassadors. But there's one other image that he paints. Has anyone noticed what it is? It's an interesting one. It's the cross. He puts the question back into the culture, but puts it behind and away and back from the actual veils, is that the men aren't able to deal with that question. It keeps on coming back, creating a problem, keeping these men awake. What do we do with the proclamation of resurrection? And Holbein is sure, it seems in the painting, that neither science nor the religious ambassadors are capable of answering it. The interesting thing is that he paints this in 1533, and we've been really smashing those two together or apart at such a pace that neither of them seems to be able to talk to each other. And it's because of that, it seems to me, and certainly from John Carroll's a humanist, is saying that we aren't able to actually deal with this question. But the important thing was that the way to deal with it was to get rid of it. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. There's lots of different flights from our great stories, our grand narratives, the story of the death of death in particular. One of the flights, and I want to talk about where we're fleeing rather than where we're going away, is the flight into fundamentalisms. I'll give you an example. Can I give you some practical examples? There's too much fundamentalism going on in the West, including religious fundamentalism and scientific fundamentalisms, proclamations of certainty. Thomas Merton, who's a great mystic, said that doubt is not opposite of faith, but constituent of it. The only thing that creates violence is certainty. Any proclamation of certainty then allows you to use violence and legitimise it, whether it's on the religious side or on the ambassador of science. Both can be appropriated. They've been appropriated in scientific materialism such as Marxism, or social Darwinism such as the disasters of the Second World War, or in the Crusades. None of these are uncertainties. And we're seeming to move, it seems, into more fundamental proclamations. It's important that we have uncertainty or doubt as part of who we are, I think, to bring these grand narratives together, or some integration. Any proclamation of certainty seems to be a flight. So, I'll give you an example. Facts have been narrowed into just logical positivism. So if you can't measure it and repeat it, then any other kind of fact claim or truth claim is discounted or relegated as secondary. It's put on the bottom shelf. Poetic truth, mythopoetic truth, are relegated to the bottom shelf. What's relegated is logical positivism, but there's a problem with it, is that when you narrowcast facts, you also narrowcast being. You reduce the dreaming. The dreaming gets cast down into something other than the totality of who we are. Or what one philosopher said, the problem with facts is not that they aren't useful, they aren't nutritious enough. How do I know this as an organisational psychologist? Because facts have been appropriated to argue any particular case. We know in psychology on motivated reasoning that people will use facts to argue a certain position. It's why the scientists, the poor buggers, and I'm one of them, are exacerbated about climate change, because facts are appropriated on both sides of the argument. So the scientists are at a loss as well, because we narrowcast our diet of information in order to confirm something that we already hold to be true. And that's what a fundamentalism does. The problem, folks, is that religion is on the increase, whether you want it or not. But it's the kind of religion that bothers me. It's a form of fact or certainty. There is no faith in the rise of fundamentalism, because doubt is excluded as part of the human condition. There's no softening of who we are, no provisionality, no dialogue, but certain proclamations of truth. And you see this when people of religion and atheists go out to battle and they go into these claims of facts. Anyone would know with a basic understanding of mystical theology that God is not a thing, not a flying spaghetti monster. So to raise up a thing and then shut it down is absolutely right. Well, what Thomas Halleck said is that the God that you talk about is one that I too don't believe in, because it's idolatry, it's a form of construction, a convenient one for arguments that we shouldn't really need to have. There's some other flights too, which is the flights into consumption and acquisitivism. Or I think Kathy Gruth calls this self as stomach. So this is this idea of, well, this stuff is too hard. We can't deal with these great stories. We're not going to retell them and reimagine them. We're going to flee from them and create bucket lists. So we're going to now consume our way out of the problem. It's kind of the Rousseauistic self-project gone mad without any restraint. To hell with the death of death, I'm on a cruise to the Antarctic. Rather than maybe respecting the Antarctic by bloody leaving it alone. Did you see the difference? Is that, that the earth grows weary under the weight of our own consumption. To me, that's, as a psychologist, a flight. It's not going into the very practice of what's needed, but away from it. The other flight is this idea of entanglement, where bumper stickers are bound with a new creed. And one of the creeds that you find on a bumper sticker is who has the most toys wins. Have you ever seen it? Or I'm spending my children's inheritance. These are new creeds of flights. Flights away from our responsibility. Edmund Burke once said that you can't care for future generations if you don't know how to bury the dead. Our relationship with both the past and the future is essential. But if technology has to wipe it clean, and I mean the past and the stories, we're buggered. Because the problem is that we don't know how to look at the future if we don't know how to honour death. I know Edmund Burke has some real problems for me, but I think that that's a really important thing, away from acquiring stuff. I'm talking about the importance of culture here. And there's a flight into relativism. And relativism looks a bit like this. Your truth is yours and mine is mine, and that's okay. Now the problem with relativism is the worst kind of insidious kind of what they call intolerant tolerance. and you get a lot of it when you actually do a lot of open forum work, is that people won't say where they stand, lest it might offend somebody. But it's a form of intolerance. And everything gets relativised. There are no hierarchies anymore. There is just relative truths. And the problem is that we can't then have an agreement of where we need to stand in order to do that. It's interesting about Indigenous cultures, and quite a lot of them are like this, certainly in Australian Indigenous cultures. They don't have a great respect for their young kids. Auntie and uncle are really important. The elders matter. So there is a hierarchy of the claims of truth. But technology loves speed, and speed loves youth. And so we imitate the young and terrified of wisdom. And so we move between information and data and celebrate its success with ever-increasing speed. But the problem, of course, when you go and see someone like me, is that the most common complaint is what? I'm exhausted. Because the very logic of technology is speed. Relativism basically relativises stories where Homer Simpson is equal to Homer. There are no hierarchical truth statements anymore. They're all relative. And the problem with that is that we can no longer stand anywhere, because anywhere will get you there. But where are we going? Nobody knows. And that's the problem. There's no teleos. There's no final cause, as Aristotle says. It's just random. I think the kids use the word random. It's really interesting. This one might hurt a bit, but there's a flight away from Western notions of transcendence and asceticism. Can I give you some examples? Carnevale. You're familiar with Carnevale? Carnevale is a big festival in the West. It's usually celebrated on Shrove Tuesday, which is just before Ash Wednesday, which is just before Christians enter into 40 days of Lent. Now, Ronald Rolheiser said that you can't experience the sublime without sublimation. Buddhists know this too. You can't experience the sublime without the technology of sublimation. That is to deny the self. Now, the interesting thing is that Carnevale literally means goodbye to the flesh. It was a ritual all across the West and in South America where you would have whoopee, right? So you'd eat flesh and you would do it through a persona, which is a mask. The idea, it's brilliant technology, brilliant social technology. It was there to protect the true self. So you could create a false self, have one hell of a great time, you take the mask off as a signifier of the persona, and then get on with the hard work of sublimating, denying the self. Necessary for the experience of the sublime. The problem, of course, now is that the West doesn't know how to sublimate. Can I give you another example? One of the very large supermarket chains said, with the hot cross bun, you know, the Easter hot cross bun, go early and go hard. So the idea of consumption is not to sublimate, is to go early and go hard, rather than to go slow and go low. Because you can't have a certain kind of asceticism. Now, here's the problem. All of these traditions are we're flying away from the Western ones, and interestingly enough, often into the Eastern traditions of asceticism. But the problem is that the Eastern traditions have a certain kind of asceticism which has a different form of teleos, a certain end of things. Now, for instance, Raymond Panica, who's both a Hindu and a Catholic priest, said that if you go to yoga and you learn to stretch and move and be really flexible and to be alert, and your body is felt and tight and very attractive, he said it's good for you, but it's bad for yoga. Because there's no sublimation of the self. and we're back to Rousseau. If we're back to imitating each other, then, and the project is me, we can appropriate other forms of asceticism. And that troubles me a little bit, because it offends, I think, the tradition of which it's been appropriated. I was talking to a man who goes to Bali and he lives there, and he loves Bali and wants to live there because he loves the Hindu culture and how gentle the Balinese are and how prayerful they are, which I think is wonderful. But I asked him a question. I says, what happens when you get really sick? He says, oh shit, I'm on the first plane out of there. So he lives in it, but not of it. He's living in two worlds. He'll have the Western hospitality, and the Western science, but won't live fully as those people in Bali. Cake and eat it. To me, there's a certain kind of inauthenticness about it, about his own being. Of course, I didn't say that, but it made me think. An appropriation away from the asceticism that was given us for the sublime. And it's everywhere. The sublime's everywhere, but you've got to learn how to sublimate. And the purpose and project of culture is to teach you how to do that, which leads to this other flight, which is away from history and tradition into nowism. The now is, have you noticed that the now is a really big thing in the West at the moment? You know, mindfulness and being in the now, in the present moment. I meditate, had done for 13 years, but in the Catholic mystical tradition. And contemplation in the Catholic mystical tradition is very similar to the Buddhist notion of the word meditation. Meditation in the Western tradition is to think. The contemplation is the idea of kenosis, emptying of the self, which is actually the tradition. Now, that particular kind of experience is actually incredibly difficult. But when one goes into that present moment of the now has both a now and later. It has a teleos. The Buddhists do too. So that there is both reincarnation and extinguishment of it, and the moment of all things being as they are, but actually to transcend them. Where in the contemplative tradition of the church is not to transcend them, but to incarnate them. So this idea of kenosis, emptying, is to empty the self sufficiently for theosis, which is a radical damn thing, which is to incarnate God in the tradition. What's that got to do with anything? Well, the now that we've got now is devoid of teleos. It's just now. When you go to a Benedictine monastery, you say the doxology, which is the doxos, which is taught between two poems, which are the Psalms. And it says, glory be to the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What is now will shall and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. So what it's saying is where we are now is also forever. It's not just now, but also forever. So there's a teleos to the now. But the problem is that the now is really for us. So there's an impulsivity to the now, where the self becomes the centre of things. The other thing too is the flight from tradition means that that the only substitute for tradition is bad tradition. That we don't get rid of tradition, we create new ones. And that's the flight. It's the flight away from the responsibility of somehow retelling the stories. 65% of British people under the age of 30 do not know what D-Day is. So those great stories, we're fleeing from them. I remember hearing somebody in our discussion on the first night, let's just move on. I'm a bit concerned about that, because where are we going to and what are we moving from, you know, in terms of the great stories of Homer, etc., etc. Retelling the stories matters. Can I give you another very practical example? Some guy, I can't remember who he was, and I don't know if this is true, again, I might be making it up as well. It was in Albany, runs into a theatre and says, for God's sake, we need to honour our dead, or lest we forget. The birth of the Anzac tradition was somebody that had to rent the Australian people out of their forgetting and create a ritual of remembrance, because the only way that you can move forward is in the paradox of remembering. That's why lest we forget is a warning. Is that some very clever person that knows about culture knows that if you forget your dreaming, you're in trouble. And remembering them, midrashing them, retelling them matters. Nowism is a flight from that. We all do it. I'm in it together. We're all in it together. So there's credo everywhere, and I'll finish with this, folks, and I really appreciate people coming to these lectures. Credo's everywhere, but what do we believe in, and do we need it for collective action? So as a psychologist, do we need enough shared commitment through shared understanding to do stuff, whatever it might be? How do we get together? Now, the old creed, this creed here, took about 56 years to bed down from, I think, 325 in Nicene, Constantinople. And it was really about this culture trying to make some understanding of what they believed about the death of death, which is the Christian creed. And so they were really grappling with the implications of that proclamation in a culture. It's dreaming. How does the dreaming of that culture work in light of that proclamation? And we've been battling with that right through. Holbein says that one way of dealing with it is to get rid of it. So did Nietzsche, so did Freud. Nietzsche said get rid of it because we can become the will, the self-made project. Freud does something even more demolishing with the creeds. He says they're pathological. So if you believe in these things, you believe in the fairy monster. And he says something I think is rather arrogant of a human being. He says it's actually a defence against death, as if he knew how to face it. That is, that it's an infantile regression. I wouldn't agree with that. I think we need them. I think we need creeds. We need beliefs. And the reason is because of this, is that when a human being is falling asunder, they may not have the strength, but the community may in order to hold it. So having some sort of belief system, whatever it might be, is essential for human health. Because you may be falling apart, but there's just enough people in the group to hold. The Sangha in the community of the Buddhists, and Ecclesia in the community of the Christians. So these Sangha or Ecclesia are necessary to hold you while you're falling apart, because they're holding the creed. But if the story falls apart, nothing is held while you're falling apart. It's a bit like what Holbein's saying. So we've got other creeds, like this one, which I thought was rather interesting, which was an anti-creed. The lady doth protest too much. So this classic humanism, which is we're going to get rid of creeds by actually having a non-creed, which is what? It's a creed. It's a form of belief. All I'm doing is to demonstrate is that you can't escape them. The only substitute of tradition is another one. So even not having one is a creed. You can't get rid of them. They're necessary for the health and well-being. So it's an interesting one, but it's a kind of, I think, a bit of an immature one. But anyway, this is kind of the anti-creed creed. Hope I won't get sued for it. And then you have these other creeds, like the small business creed, and these might be helpful for you to grow your business. But there are creeds everywhere. And they are belief systems that we use to get us up in the morning. But I'm wondering whether a creed like that would be strong enough to deal with the great big three questions. Where am I from? How to live my life? And what happens when we die? Does anybody know what that is? In 1917, in New York, Duchamp enters an arts competition and he enters the urinal. He doesn't win, I'm sure he doesn't win, but he causes a sensation. And the sensation is very simple, but it's very powerful, and it's still very much facing us today. And it's this: who's to tell us what truth is, what aesthetics is, and what is art? Anything can be it, and so I proclaim a urinal to be as equal as the painting that you saw of Holbein's. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I quite like some of this proclamation, but it has a certain impact on our being, which is everything is flattened. Everything is not only permitted, but a source, not only a source of truth, is truth, which is a little bit problematic because it's good for you, but it might be bad for us when we go to talk about things together. And I think that's what's going on at the moment, is that everything proclaims to be relative. And it's an interesting thing. The ultimate end is that we move from kind of Holbein and Caravaggio to piss price in 500 years. It's interesting that we're able to do that. And I don't mind it, but the implications of it is interesting, which is a form of kind of relativism. This is from, and I'll finish with this, and I hope this has been at least, we're talking about something that's been challenging for all of you, as it is for me, and this is from John Carroll, so that you don't sort of think that these are my own ideas, but one's from this book of The Wreck of the Western Culture and some of the things that he argues. He says that we need to midrash our ancient and sacred stories, whatever they might be, which includes the scientific one, and retell them in a way that speaks to the new times. Might be interested to know that when they published the Big Bang Theory, did you know about this? I think in Nature. Do you know that it was rejected initially? Do you know why it was rejected? Because at that stage, everybody thought the origin of the universe was from the notion of Aristotle, that there was no actual origin like the Big Bang. It was rejected because it sounded too much like the Judeo-Christian story of Genesis. It's interesting that such a thing could happen, but it did because of the power of story and what the story does to our dreaming, because it interrupted the great tradition of Aristotle, and also it somehow had a problem with looking too much like a myth. After all, every living culture is inwardly driven to midrash, and that's really the kind of the when we're going to have some questions around it. But what John Carroll is saying is we're storytellers and we need to tell stories. But he's arguing, what stories do we need to tell in order for us to hold together? And he's saying that the act of retelling them is the act of culture. And that's the purpose and the drive for the Western dreaming. Aboriginal people know that in order to keep a culture alive, you have to respect their law, that their law is real, that their elders are respectable, and their cosmology and gods are worthy of honouring. And those things seem to be necessary in all cultures to keep them alive. And the way that you do that is in the retelling of the great grand stories that we've been listening to for the past 3 weeks. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been of some interest.
Crying, denying, trying.